the creation of a sequel for a series lost to time, many angles have to be considered. A common misconception of this process is that the new entry of said game needs to follow a very close, if not exact, blueprint of what was originally done. It's very normal as a fan of a game or story that you either grew up with or that played a seminal role in part of your life that you would want that memory and experience preserved. There are plenty of instances over the years where once popular games return and don't receive the fanfare that you would expect. After all, it's not always a simple task to recapture the magic of something that thrived decades ago, let alone do that if the original developer is not attached. You have to ask yourself if sometimes the things you love belong in the past, because in today's gaming landscape, people expect much different things. What once sold very well might not appeal to larger demographics, especially younger ones who grew up without these genres leading the way. A choice has to be made. Do you follow that exact blueprint and risk it not reaching a new audience? Do you try something brand new, or do you find a middle ground? For Sly Cooper, there seems to be only one path forward: change, but only where it counts. Suckerpunch launched Sly Cooper and the Thieveus Racconus in September of 2002, an admittedly much simpler game in scope than its PlayStation 2 mascot counterparts. It's also a much shorter project, but also a very unique one in structure. Sly Cooper's games took place in the format of episodes, very reminiscent of the Saturday morning cartoon where each episode has a well-drawn title card and has a sense of individuality to them. Sly's cutscenes feel just like that, comic book-esque and quick and to the point. It's a clever way to grab the attention of an audience. The animation work required for lip movement on Sly wasn't ready to carry the storytelling of the series. In the process of this, you end up with the entire series' identity. It just isn't a Sly Cooper game if those types of scenes are not integrated in some form. Now, Sly Cooper is a very well done franchise. Nothing can really detract from that. That said, it has the harder path to working well in current times than Ratchet did or Jak has. I mentioned recently that Sony has plenty of sales numbers and data that show Sly Cooper isn't the most viable franchise to spend money on right now. After a little pushback from the Sly community, I dove deeper. And after playing 4 Sly Cooper games in 4 days, I've come to a different conclusion. There is a way Sly can come back, but first you have to acknowledge what Sly did so well to receive 3 sequels and the flaws that landed him in video game purgatory. You have to judge a game like Sly within the expectations of when they came out. It's one platformer where things cannot stay the same if this is to be successful again. In the first entry, you have a very simple plot and a very simple goal. Sly's parents were killed by a group called the Fiendish Five, and as a result he grew up in an orphanage where he met his future gang members Bentley and Murray. After some growing up, the Thieveus Racconus, the book containing all his past ancestors' most formidable techniques, has been stolen. You have to get it back. Simple enough, and that's about all the exposition you need and are given beyond some descriptions of your foes as you encounter them. Exposition is something very polarizing about Sly Cooper as a franchise. Story-wise, you're given the bare minimum in cutscenes, and characters carry things along through small conversations. It works, but in-game you're given far too much exposition at times. This largely stays the same for Sly's entire run, with the Suckerpunch trilogy anyway. Bentley will explain what you have to do as if you were born at the beginning of every mission. Now, it's worth noting by design this somewhat makes sense given its release year and target demographic. However, this goes on in every game. You're removed from gameplay quite often. As the games get longer in runtime, this can begin to wear on you. Sly 1 was a short, concise game. Any problems that it had mostly stemmed from health balancing issues and checkpoints sometimes being too far apart. Something that most games of this style suffered from. It's very much a product of its time, and it holds up where it counts today. Sly 2 Band of Thieves was an improvement in almost every way. The storytelling got a bit more streamlined. It wasn't just a tiny cutscene in between each episode giving you a summarized version of what's going on. They did a much better job fitting storytelling into gameplay sections of each level. The levels were greatly expanded. Sly 2 was the first game in the series that decided to have mostly open levels. Rather than follow a linear level path that was Sly 1, you had bigger spaces, which in turn created much more interesting missions. There was a larger variety in what you were doing mission to mission, not as much point A to B design. However, the open levels in Sly 2 did create a new issue. In most episodes, there was not a large variety in how you had to get to the most used sections of the levels for starting missions. You would leave the safe house and have to use the exact same route to get to these sections, and it gets very tiring. Sly is given the most viable means of navigating around via climbing and being able to press circle to balance on things, but when you introduce the ability to play as the rest of the gang, it's not as easy. Making Bentley and Murray playable was a needed addition from both a gameplay and storytelling perspective. Throughout the trilogy, you see Bentley and Murray slowly transition from tools for Sly to use to fully fledged members of the team that offer their own unique gameplay options, which again add variety to the things that you're doing. It raises the quality of the story being told in every way. But in Sly 2, moving around big open levels as the other two members is not quite as fun. It can get repetitive enough climbing the exact same route as Sly many times per episode, but when you strip away that option for Bentley and Murray, who are restricted to only being able to jump, you are having to spend much more time navigating to the mission start, which brings the game's runtime up considerably, only walking to the mission start. Which in turn is a part of the game where the repetition and what they are asking of you in missions starts to make itself a bit apparent. How many of these completely different operations require you to pickpocket 4 different people? You're doing a lot of the same things over and over with a small variety in how you can approach each of them. Even with these new issues created by new features, Sly 2 is better than its predecessor in almost every way, with tons of new gameplay mechanics and challenges. Even with all this improvement, Sly had so much room to grow as they approached their third game. Sly 3 Band of Thieves fixed all of these issues. The story being told was so much more realized, especially post Bentley suffering a big injury leaving him in a wheelchair. It was the first time Bentley and Murray felt like equals to Sly. Things could have gotten stale for the series after 2 if they left it to just the main 3. But adding in an entire new cast of playable characters that actually play differently and aren't just simple gimmicks takes things to a new level. You have so many new mechanics introduced in each episode and it constantly feels fresh. The repetition of Sly 2 is in every way sorted out here. It also again greatly enhances Suckerpunch's ability to tell more meaningful stories. Seeing Sly go through the motions and realize he wasn't being true to himself in his affection for Carmelita, Bentley having an equally as nerdy counterpart, and Murray still wanting to train with the Guru made for a great segue. A segue to finish the series, and it ended well. Everyone ended up where they should, plotlines all squared away. When a series comes to an end, or so you think, there are always going to be fans that want it to continue in any way possible, no matter the cost or how conclusive it had ended. So the announcement and eventual release of Sly Cooper Thieves in Time was polarizing. It was developed outside of Suckerpunch by Sanzaru Games. They chose to make a game that as closely as possible resembled what people loved about Sly Cooper. It wasn't a new take, it wasn't a reboot, it was Sly Cooper. The gameplay was the best the series has had all in all. Visually, it was a stunning PlayStation 3 game, although a bit of a departure from what was done at Sucker Punch. Clearly, Sanzaru understood what made a Sly game, but they didn't quite stick the landing in its writing, making it the entire series' most divisive talking point. This is what can happen when you continue a series after it gets such a well-done conclusive ending. Sanzaru nailed almost everything about Sly Cooper, but they made a decision to leave the plot in a very poor state, which is an especially strange decision to make when you are never guaranteed a sequel. Your main protagonist is in a completely undetermined location. Penelope's entire personality had been changed, affecting Bentley's ending, and the Carmelita dynamic was completely thrown out. Thieves in Time is a sequel that unraveled what had already been so expertly crafted in Sly 3. The main reason Sly feels like it needs another game is simply because this would need to be retconned in some way. The game also just went on to sell softly regardless of its quality. So how do you approach a new Sly Cooper game 10 years later? There are really only 2 options, only one of which is viable. If they make a Sly Cooper 5 that follows the series' conventions and picks up after Thieves in Time, they're setting themselves up for failure as much as fans of the original games would love nothing more. There are not enough current Sly fans to carry that type of game to success. Unless you remake Sly 1 through 3 and make 4 accessible on current hardware, you're asking a lot of potential new fans just to be able to enjoy a sequel. And Sony's never going to greenlight a Sly game even on a smaller budget to not make a big return financially. They are clearly only in the interest of massive AAA games. The reality is, the only way you can get a new Sly game that turns a profit is if it gets a soft reboot, but there has never been a better time to explore this. Take a good look at all of the active genres in the industry right now. There is one that is being severely underrepresented, and it's a genre that has plenty of room to be filled by multiple different IP. Where are all the stealth games? Games like Metal Gear Solid that paved the way are nowhere to be found. Splinter Cell has a remake in the works, but still nothing new. Dishonored is done, Deus Ex is gone. There are plenty of games that have great stealth options, but little to none with it as their main focus. We lost Assassin's Creed to trends years ago. Now they're just games based in different time periods that put in the bare minimum of what Assassin's Creed lore is just so they can use that IP to drive sales. If we're being honest, Sly Cooper on PlayStation 2 offered better stealth options than modern Assassin's Creed does today. The point is that there are slots to be filled and no one is doing a good job outside of Hitman. If there were ever an opportune time to take a big risk with Sly Cooper, it's probably this generation. Sly Cooper would need to be different. Levels could stand to get bigger as long as good design complemented it. It wouldn't hurt to have a similar structure of the older Assassin's Creed games just for the sake of scale. But even Ghost of Tsushima, which has so much Sly DNA in it, would be a great game to look at assuming something was made outside of Suckerpunch. The combat could all around get better and develop some level of depth, so there's meaning in swinging the cane around. It was never used to its fullest potential. With how Sly's boss fights function, there is opportunity in current tech to scale them up and make them larger than life, which is why a larger world actually makes sense for Sly. Black Myth Wukong is all the proof you need that Sly Cooper could garner massive interest again. The attention this game commands is massive, and it's a direction Sly could still take while retaining what it is at its core. You would yet again have a big decision to make in the way of an art style. It would probably suit it to follow something similar to Ratchet & Clank or even Black Myth Wukong more preferably, but with a completely different color palette. It's a losing battle to follow up Thieves in time. A soft reboot where you retain a lot of the cast and move in a completely different direction would be much more well suited for success. Suckerpunch is currently all in on Ghost of Tsushima, which is a natural progression of Sly Cooper in many ways. And Sanzaru Games is now exclusively a partner of Oculus Rift, developing solely in virtual reality. It's hard to determine where this game could even come from unless Sucker Punch had multiple teams like how Insomniac functions, and even then there's too much design crossover between Sly Cooper and where Ghost of Tsushima is headed. As of right now, you probably won't see the thieving raccoon for quite a while, but there is room for it. Somebody just needs to step up to the plate.